When he came, around the same period Castro came, he was the highest-ranking Soviet official ever to visit the U.S., and he was here for 2 weeks, which is unusual for a foreign visitor. I guess flying was not as easy in those days, and he stayed longer. And relations had been very bad, and it was supposed to be a goodwill tour, and Meet the Press came at the end of his tour, and it was done in Washington out at the station, and we had an extra hour, an extra half hour, so we had a full hour because it had to be interpreted, and at that time we were doing only consecutive interpretation, where you say it in English and then it's translated into Russian, and he says it in Russian and it's translated into English. So half the time is wasted in translating. Later we were able to do simultaneous shows, but anyway, he had tremendous security. There was a lot of interest in the show. The police and the security people were swarming over NBC. They were ringed. The police were all around the lot, standing out at the perimeters of the yard, which is quite large. It's not like an office in the middle of New York City or Los Angeles. And they were up on the catwalks over the studio. It was the most intensive security that I recall of any show that I saw. There was one other in New York once before when I wasn't there, that had a lot for George Wallace. But anyway, we got through, and it was very tough questioning. There were 4 reporters, including Lawrence Spivak. But at the end of the program, and Mikoyan did not answer all the questions directly. He sort of fudged some of them. But at the end of the program, the last question Spivak asked looked pretty long. I timed it later, and it only ran about 20 seconds. He could talk very fast. And there was the moderator, Ned Brooks, at that point, I believe, had to interrupt, and he said, "I'm sorry, but our time is up," which it was. We always stopped by the clock. We did this every week. People here were used to it. They knew that at a certain point the moderator would interrupt, no matter who was saying what. And but the Russians were very offended by it. Ambassador Menshikov was in the studio at the time, and he was outraged. I don't think that the Deputy Prime Minister realized at the time how offended the ambassador was by it. But after he talked with him, after he left the studio, he got very angry too. And the next day, when he was speaking at the National Press Club, he talked about how nasty, what a dirty trick. I've forgotten exactly how I phrased it, but that was the essence of it, that Lawrence Spivak had played on him by asking him a question he didn't have time to answer. Well, there wasn't time to translate it into Russian, much less get the answer. But we tried to explain to them that this is just the format of the show, and it had nothing to do, it wasn't planned that way at all. It might never have happened. But they just didn't believe it. And for years we couldn't get another Russian to go on the show. It was a major problem. But eventually they did understand. Two things happened. Well, first of all, after this, we made a point of warning that the time was coming up in that format. Ned Brooks would say, approximately, we have just about 2 minutes left, so that the audience and the guests would get an idea the show was going to end soon. We had never done that before. In fact, the week before Mikoyan was on, I think we had Bobby Kennedy, and he got cut off in the middle of an answer. But anyway, that didn't satisfy the Russians. But many years later, Mr. Spivak was at the UN, and he ran into Menshikov, who had been the ambassador and who was very, very involved with U.S.-Soviet relations. He was a very influential ambassador. And he said, I realize now that you're equally mean to everybody, which Mr. Spivak thought was a great compliment. He was very pleased. And we did in recent years. We've certainly, since the end of the Cold War, we had a number of Russian guests.